Our speaker this week is Dr. Kendal WIlliams, and his topic is Who is Baha'u'llah? An Introduction to His Life and Teachings. Dr. Kendal WIlliams, MD, MPH, is a professor of medicine at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine, where he has been engaged in medical student and residency education for over 2 decades. He founded the Penn Center for Evidence-Based Practice and was the inpatient service chief for Penn Presbyterian for almost 10 years. More recently, he has devoted his free time to developing the Baha'i website sifterofdust.org, intended to be a resource for people exploring the teachings of the Baha'i Faith and its writings. And with that, I'll hand it off to Dr. WIlliams.
Thank you, Bayan, for that introduction. It's wonderful to be back with you here again for an opportunity to talk about a very basic subject of the Baha'i Faith, and that is, who is Baha'u'llah? It may be a fundamental subject to learning about the Baha'i Faith, but it's not an easy subject, and it's not something that can be fit into a simple talk. In fact, this talk I've decided to divide into 2 portions. So there'll be a part 1 and also a part 2 posted on YouTube channel, but also on the Sifter of Dust website. So let's jump into it.
So first off, I want to say I'm going to be using this symbol as a representation for Baha'u'llah throughout the talk. Baha'is do not show pictures of Baha'u'llah. We only, we don't worship his figure or his form. So this is Baha'u'llah's taj, headdressing he wore. And I'm going to use that as sort of the replacement for his image throughout the talk. So I want to start with something fairly common. Now, I'm in Philadelphia, okay? So if you're from Philadelphia, and certainly if you're a Philadelphia sports fan, you recognize this as an iconic image. It is the 2017 World Championship of the Super Bowl win by the Philadelphia Eagles. And the gentleman in the center there holding the trophy is Nick Foles, the quarterback who quarterbacked them to the victory. To his left, the gentleman with the hats is Doug Peterson, who was and is the head coach of the Philadelphia Eagles. To the far left is Jeffrey Lurie, who runs the team, who owns the team. And the gentleman with his back turned is a guy named Carson Wentz, who's now the quarterback of the Eagles, who Nick Foles was replacing. So I know you're an international audience and you don't know these people, but there's an important point I want to make here. When Doug Peterson and Nick Foles came to the podium, both of them are Christian, to deliver some remarks after they had won the Super Bowl. Now, this was the peak of both of their careers. Doug Peterson had been a backup quarterback for years in the NFL. He never really started. He came to be a head coach. He had never had much notoriety. The Eagles hired him, and 2 years later, he won the Super Bowl. This was the peak of his career. And the first words out of his mouth in front of hundreds of millions of people were, "I would like to thank my Lord Jesus Christ, my Savior, for this opportunity." He didn't say, "I'd like to thank Jeffrey Lurie, who hired him," who's the man on the left. He didn't thank his quarterback who just won him a Super Bowl. He didn't thank his wife. He thanked somebody who lived 2,000 years ago on another continent. And if we pause for a moment and think about this, Nick Foles said a very similar thing when he won. And if you step back from this and think about it, it's a very odd thing, right? Why is he thanking someone who lived 2,000 years ago? And we see this all the time, right, in our society. It's not unusual at all. But why is it not unusual, right? So what exactly is going on here that people feel that they want to thank somebody who lived only 31 years of life 2,000 years ago, right? So the representation of Christ that we have in our minds is different than who he is just as a person, right? Or just the history of him, right? The reason that he is prominent now 2,000 years ago, or 2,000 years later, is because of his claims, because of the significance of his claims. And these are scattered throughout the Gospels. I've only put a few of them here, where he claimed to be from God, and actually representing God. I and the Father are one. And then he said, I am the bread of life. Who comes to me shall never hunger, and he who believes in me shall never. I'm having a little trouble because I have to minimize the people. Thank you, because I can't read the slide. So, and he who believes in me shall never thirst. I am the way, the truth, and the life, and no one comes to the Father but through me. So these statements of Christ have hit to the heart of human beings, even now 2,000 years later. And we only talk about Christ because of these claims. That's what makes him significant to us. So when we ask this question, who is Baha'u'llah, we're actually asking the same thing, because what's significant about whatever happened, whatever that phenomenon was when Jesus Christ made those claims, it's happened again. And the simple way to know and understand Baha'u'llah is just to look at Christ and make an analogy and just say, whatever that was, it's happened again, because that's exactly what it is. So Baha'u'llah spoke throughout his writings, which span over 40 years, thousands of tablets, the largest body of religious writings that history has ever known. And throughout those writings, he implicitly or explicitly claims to be from God. This is a famous passage. I could have chosen dozens of them that are in English. This is the one I had at hand to make this point. And in which Baha'u'llah says, naught is seen in my temple but the temple of God. Naught meaning nothing. Nothing is seen in my temple but the temple of God. And in my beauty but his beauty. And in my being but his being. And in myself but himself. And in my movement but his movement. And in my acquiescence but his acquiescence. And in my pen but his pen. There has not been in my soul but the truth. And in myself naught can be seen but God. That is a statement that is as powerful as any that is made in the Gospels in terms of a claim to divine authority. His pen is the pen of God. So in 1863, in a garden outside of Baghdad, Baha'u'llah announced formally this claim to the world. This is not that garden, by the way. I'm using this slide as a representation. We don't have pictures of that garden, unfortunately. This is another garden known as the Garden of Rezvan, which was somewhat of a representation that's been built at the Baha'i Holy Centers in the Holy Land where the Baha'is go for pilgrimage. But these are the passages in which Baha'u'llah makes his claim. As I said, I could have chosen dozens of them. Baha'u'llah says, this is the day in which mankind can behold the face and hear the voice of the promised one. The call of God has been raised, and the light of his countenance, the light of his face, has been lifted up upon men. It behooveth everyone to blot out the trace of every idle word from the tablet of his heart, and to gaze with an open and unbiased mind on the signs of his revelation, the proofs of his mission, and the tokens of his glory. So here Baha'u'llah is telling us that in this day, or in the day that he announced that mission, we could behold the face of the one that had been promised in the Quran, in the Bible, and all the religious texts of the past that would one day come and usher in a period of peace to the planet. And he says, everyone should relinquish all prejudice and look with an open and unbiased mind upon those signs of his revelation. Very powerful and challenging statement. Baha'u'llah went on to say, in describing his own revelation, his own body of teachings to humanity, O ye that dwell on earth, the distinguishing feature that marks the preeminent character of this supreme revelation, seeing he's describing his own revelation as the supreme revelation, consist in that we have on the one hand blotted out from the pages of God's holy book whatsoever has been the cause of strife, of malice, and mischief among the children of men, and have on the other laid down the essential prerequisites of concord, of understanding, of complete and enduring unity. Mankind in its entirety must firmly adhere unto that which hath vouchsafed from it. There are some languages in the Baha'i writings that may not be familiar. The first is that Baha'u'llah refers to himself as a we, okay, as opposed to an I. And that is a form of expression known as the royal we, in which individuals of great authority, it comes from British English, the King's English, where the king would refer to himself as a we in various royal decrees. And it had this sense that it was a higher expression that came from a source of authority. And so when the Baha'i writings are translated into English, they're translated in the same way as the King James Bible, which uses the same form of expression. And so when Baha'u'llah refers to himself as we, he's not that he's referring to himself as more than one person. It's just that it's spoken with the divine authority. But this last line, mankind in its entirety must firmly adhere to this. Baha'u'llah explicitly said, he said, my revelation was not for, and is not for one land or one people only. Mankind in its entirety must firmly adhere unto that which hath been given it. Vouchsafed means given to it. So Baha'u'llah not only invited everyone to explore his revelation with an open and unbiased mind, he told everyone on the planet, this revelation is for you, everyone on the planet. Another passage from Baha'u'llah announcing the meaning of his revelation, he says, O well-beloved ones, the tabernacle of unity has been raised. Regard you not one another as strangers. Ye are the fruits of one tree and the leaves of one branch. Verily I say, whatsoever leads to the decline of ignorance and the increase of knowledge hath been and will ever remain approved in the sight of the Lord of creation. Baha'u'llah is speaking with the voice of God, telling us that the tabernacle of unity has been raised. So this term tabernacle may not be familiar to you. So it comes actually from the ancient Hebrew. The Israelites were a tribal peoples, but they worshiped one God. And they would come and they would move their nomadic, they would move as tribal peoples to another setting. And they would raise a temporary place of worship that all people could gather in. That was known as the tabernacle. So, and they would raise it every time they moved. So they would move their tents and then they'd raise the tabernacle. So Baha'u'llah is saying the tabernacle of unity has been raised. That now the worship of the one God is now a church of unity, a tabernacle of unity. And so this is very significant that he's making this claim and expressing to us what God wants from us. And this teaching, this revelation has spread throughout the planet. It's now the most diverse community of people on the planet, certainly the most diverse religious community on the planet. That introductory video that showed different groups of people, they're all studying the words and the revelation of Baha'u'llah within the context of his claims. So I think when we ask the question, who is Baha'u'llah, it's actually three questions. The first question is, who was here? And there's a story there. And the second question is, who is Baha'u'llah theologically? Just as we would ask with Christ in the same way, you know, who is Christ? We ask, what does this claim mean? I mean, how does somebody claim to be God? How do you even come to that, make that claim without it sounding ridiculous? So who is Baha'u'llah theologically? And then what's most important for anybody who believes a religion is who is Baha'u'llah experientially. So, you know, I would venture to say that the people on that podium who were expressing their love for Jesus Christ when the Eagles won the Super Bowl and wanting to have people hear that were coming from a perspective of their own experience with the words and teachings of Jesus Christ. So there's another aspect of knowing Baha'u'llah, knowing who he is, and that's the experiential aspect that certainly all Baha'is feel, but you increasingly can feel. So I'm going to start by telling you the story of Baha'u'llah's life. And it starts in a country that is now known as Iran. For many people, Iran is only heard of, in the international news and so forth. But it's important to know this area of the world if you want to understand Baha'u'llah. Iran used to be known as Persia. The name was changed in the early 20th century. And everything about it culturally is referred to as Persian culture. The Persian Empire was one of the great empires stretching back thousands of years, over 2,000, maybe 3,000 years. And Persia is one of the longest running civilizations on the earth in terms of its impact. The Persians were extremely important in Islamic civilization. Some of the great scholars and mystics and poets of the Islamic civilization were Persian. Avicenna, probably one of the most brilliant minds ever to live, and a doctor and a philosopher and a theologian and a scientist. He was Persian. So Persians have a rich cultural and educated history. By the way, just as because this is not well known, Persians are not Arabs. They're separate and they speak a different language. They speak a language known as Farsi. And it's very similar to Urdu or Hindi, which is down in India. So they share that language grouping. It's an Indo-European language. And of course, Islam, because the religion of Persia since the 7th century or so has been mostly Islam, the forms of the religious expression is in Arabic. But Persians would grow up speaking Farsi and not Persian. And they're very different languages. They don't have anything in common, really, except that in Persian has a lot of Arabic words. So this is the province of Persia that Baha'u'llah grew up. He was born in 1817. And he was born into a province or into a family that lived in the north. Now, we think of Iran, of Persia, as a very dry climate, and it is, but this northern area is not dry. It's very lush. There are rich forests. They could never invade Iran or Persia from the north because they'd have to go through the forest and the land. It was impossible to get through this area because there was too much high ground. It is richly beautiful, comparable to any of the most beautiful mountain ranges and areas that exist in the world. So Baha'u'llah was born here. And he was born in this small village called Takur, near another town that was more towards the sea called Nur. And Baha'u'llah was born and was raised in this house. His father was a wealthy minister in the court of the Shah. His father was a very talented man. He was a very talented calligrapher and had many other skills that the Shah's court found very valuable. And so Baha'u'llah's father raised his family in this house, and they had 2 other homes. So he was raised as a wealthy, courtly young person. And so he wasn't raised with any religious training formally. He would have learned the basics of Islam and so forth, but he wouldn't necessarily have learned anything but the most rudimentary Arabic. It becomes significant because Baha'u'llah reveals his writings in exquisite Arabic, but he wouldn't have learned that as a child. And he was raised really not to be a priest and not to have any religious role whatsoever, but actually to have a secular role in the civic life of the society as a minister in the court of the king. So we know some bits about Baha'u'llah's upbringing and what he would have done. He would have learned calligraphy, for instance, from his father and so forth, how to write beautifully. Which is an art form in Middle Eastern societies. This image here of calligraphy on the left of your screen is not done by Baha'u'llah. It's done by one of his very talented followers named Mishkan Kalam. But you can get a sense of the beauty and the intricacy of what goes into that effort. And so Baha'u'llah would have been trained in that. He would have been trained in how to ride a horse, and he would have ridden those horses throughout those beautiful landscapes. These horses and that landscape is from Mazandaran, Iran. So that gives you a sense of what Baha'u'llah's life would have been like growing up. Very, we know most of what we know about Baha'u'llah's childhood is actually things he told us himself. And because there's not a whole lot of historical records otherwise. There is a tablet of Baha'u'llah, a very short one. It's a letter written when he was probably 5 or 6 years old to his aunt. And it's very interesting. Baha'u'llah tells us that he always knew he was a messenger of God, that it was always part of his consciousness. And so this is I put this quote here. It's very interesting. Baha'u'llah writes to his aunt. He says, "To outward seeing, I am but a child and lack the ability to read or write. Yet because this unlettered one cleaves tenaciously to the divine lote tree," that's a symbol of God. "He reads without acquired knowledge and writes without having learned to do so." That may be the first tablet that we have of Baha'u'llah written when he was 5 or 6 years old, the first evidence of his writings. And in there, he's already making a claim to really divine connection. Remarkable, really. So as I said, most of what we know from Baha'u'llah's childhood, we know from what he told us himself. And there's a very interesting story that he tells us when he was 12 years old. He was reading in a book of history, of Muslim history, about a battle that the Muslims fought early in their development. When the Prophet Muhammad revealed his religion, he was exiled and pushed out of Mecca and went to a place called Medina, a neighboring town. And from there, they grew the Muslim community, and they were attacked frequently, and they fought back. At this time, they fought back. And so there were these wars, these battles that existed that during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and this was a story of one of those battles. And Baha'u'llah says that he read one of the stories of these battles, and it threw him into a sense of deep depression, if you will. He was very sad. And he said it lasted for about 2 weeks. And then he goes on to tell us, he's an adult telling us this. He says, "Yet as I beheld the limitless ocean of God's pardon and mercy surging before me, I would in those days implore God to bring about that which would foster love, fellowship, and unity among all the peoples of the earth." And then he goes on to say that as an adult, thereafter, through the agency of the pen of the Most High, that's his own pen, we removed at our irresistible and irrevocable bidding all mention of whatsoever has been the cause of affliction, calamity, and strife, and have revealed only that which will conduce to concord and unity. The story that Baha'u'llah tells us is probably intended to tell us that those rules that existed back in the ancient days when Islam was revealed no longer are valid. That God's will is now that that we have love, fellowship, and unity, right? And that we have the capacity to do that. And he's telling us this story, I think, to elucidate that. But it's a very powerful and interesting story. So Baha'u'llah would have been raised and was raised in that beautiful area. They had a home in Tehran, which was the major city and where the court of the Shah was, and the administrative capital. So his father would need to be there to attend to the various work. And most of the family was up in this northern area. As Baha'u'llah became a teenager and so forth, he was recognized as being very talented, and he was offered positions in the court of the Shah, and he declined to take them. At the age of 19, he got married, and he went up, and he and his wife stayed mostly in the northern area around the greenery, and he became known as the father of the poor in that area. Even as a very young man, he's only 19, 20, young 20s, serving the poor in that area and focusing on that. He had no interest in any government position. And of course, Baha'u'llah knew that his mission was different and that was not what his mission was. He understood as he has stated to us, that he was a messenger of God, and that was being a government official was not his mission. So this is a very interesting set of two passages. The date here is 1839 on the left. This is a passage that was actually discovered fairly recently by the Baha'i scholar Nader Saidi, who's at UCLA. He discovered it in the archives. It's a prayer revealed by Baha'u'llah at the time he was 22 years old. This was way before he announced his mission. And at the time in which he actually, after his father had passed, I think Baha'u'llah was 21 at that time, Baha'u'llah came to be in charge of at least a portion of the estate. And his father had slaves, and Baha'u'llah freed them. And this is the passage in which he frees them. Baha'u'llah describes this in a prayer. And he's 22 years old. He says, "O Lord my God, behold how one slave hath stood at the door of another." So he's referring to the man that is come to ask for his freedom, seeking from him his freedom. And Baha'u'llah is referring to himself as a slave, right? So he says, one slave has come to the door of another slave, and that slave is seeking from him his freedom. And Baha'u'llah says, and this despite the fact that his owner is himself thy thrall and thy servant. A thrall is a servant, right? Someone who's enamored of that which it serves. And Baha'u'llah says, how then can this thrall claim for himself ownership of any other human being? Beautiful in that Baha'u'llah is not only freeing the slaves, but telling us the moral and spiritual parameters, if you will, of why he's doing that. Because we are all servants. Baha'u'llah himself is a servant. He says, I am your servant, God. How can I own another of your servants? And then in 1873, when Baha'u'llah formally revealed his book of laws, he prohibits slavery in this language. He said, it is not for him who is himself a servant to buy another of God's servants. And this has been prohibited in his holy tablet. Thus, by his mercy hath the commandment been recorded by the pen of justice. Let no man exalt himself above another. All are but bond slaves before the Lord, and all exemplify the truth that there is none other God but him. So this sense, Baha'u'llah takes this idea that we are all servants of God, and that that no man should even exalt himself above another human being, because we all have this plane of servitude unto God. Beautiful, beautiful. That line in the middle that separates the two is a pen of Baha'u'llah himself. That we have a picture of that I use for this slide. So the Baha'i faith is said to begin in this room, and it's actually a circumstance and an event that doesn't involve Baha'u'llah personally. So it's in this room in May 23rd of 1844 that a young man, a young prophet who came to be known as the Bab, which means the gate, announced to his first follower that he was a prophet of God, come to prepare the way for one greater than himself. And it was from that point, from 1844 onwards, that not only the Bab's religion spread throughout Persia, throughout Iran, but it also prepared the path for Baha'u'llah. And I'll go through that and explain how that happened. But that's why we say the Baha'i faith has come at that time, even though Baha'u'llah wasn't there at that time. The Bab spoke himself with tremendous authority and majesty. He said, this is from his one of the original thing he revealed in that room. He says, all praise be to God, who hath through the power of truth sent down this book unto his servant, meaning himself, that it may serve as a shining light for all mankind. Verily, this is none other than the sovereign truth. It is the path which God hath laid out for all that are in heaven and on earth. So even the Bab's claims are extraordinarily challenging and spoken with tremendous authority. So the Bab was a young merchant. He was also not a priest or had any religious background. He wore the clothing of a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad, and they would wear green, so his turban would have been green. This is actually on the left is an outfit that the Bab would have worn at that time, and then some of his writing on the right. The Bab quickly became a rock star in his society. His writings were mesmerizing to both people of religious background and not of religious background. He had thousands of followers that within the next 4 years began to adhere to his religion. The Bab was doing something extremely dangerous. It was a crime punishable by death in that society to convert to another religion, to claim divine authority equivalent to that of the Prophet Muhammad, to reveal writings like you were the author of the Quran. You can imagine the impact that that had on that society. It was an extraordinarily challenging thing. And for 6 years, the Bab's religion spread throughout Iran. To give you a sense of this, the Shah himself sent his most trusted religious advisor to come and interview the Bab and denounce him. And the advisor, after 3 interviews with the Bab, wrote back to the Shah and said, "I am not coming back. I believe his claim." And that man himself became one of the martyrs for his religion. So the impact was tremendous. Many young seminary students in particular became followers of the Bab, and they were fearless. They spread his faith up through Iran. They were absolutely enamored with him. And thousands of people adopted his religion. After the Bab's claims became very clear, about 4 years into his mission, he was exiled to a prison fortress. Actually, 2 of them. This is a picture, I believe, of the second. It was a stone fortress built into a mountainside. It's fallen into decay now. This picture is more modern. But that's where he was imprisoned. And it was from a prison cell within this fortress that he wrote his holy book, his book, which he called the Bayan, or the Exposition, which he intended to be an explanation of the relation of God to humanity. So the Bab's theology is very important to understanding Baha'u'llah, because not only did he prepare the way for Baha'u'llah by announcing his claim or announcing that Baha'u'llah was coming and that his revelation was about to be unfolded, the Bab spent a great deal of time in his writings explaining why it was significant. So the theology of the Baha'i faith really begins with the Bab. And I wanted to, if we want to understand who is Baha'u'llah, one of the things we need to understand is who he is theologically. What was his claim? And so what the Bab said is that God in a direct sense, the essence of God, is not knowable to human beings. And the analogy that I think is best for this is that we are living in a painting, right? Created by a painter. The painter is the creator of the painting, just like God is the creator of the world we live in. But if you think about it, if you're living in that painting, if you can imagine this for a minute, what relationship could you possibly have with the painter herself? And the answer is nothing, right? You can't have a direct relationship with the painter because you're in 2 different planes of existence, right? This is an idea that is expressed in the Baha'i writings and in the writings of the Bab many times, that God does not exist within our world in any direct sense. She or he exists outside of our world. Another analogy that I like is more modern one is that think of we're living in a virtual reality, we're living in a video game. How could we understand the creator of the video game? The reality is we can't, right? We're living in this video game. The creator's in a completely different realm of reality. So the Bab said that when we talk about understanding God, we're not talking about understanding God directly. We're talking about understanding God as his qualities, as her qualities are revealed within the painting itself, right? So everything around us, if we're living in that painting, reflects the qualities of the painter, right? So everything around us reflects the qualities of God, the attributes of God. It's sometimes referred to in the Baha'i writings as the names and attributes of God. But, and what our most direct if you think through this analogy, what is the most direct experience that the painting has of the painter? It's the paintbrush, right? The paintbrush is what acts within the realm of the painting, right? So, and that's controlled by the hand of the painter, but is not the painter itself. So what the Bab said is that what we as humans can experience is not only the qualities of God that exist all around us, but we can experience the will of God when it's expressed more directly within creation. And you could think of that as being like the paintbrush. So the will of God, which the Bab referred to as the primal will of God, in the sense that everything comes from it. Like everything in the painting comes from the paintbrush, right? So the Bab referred to the paintbrush as the primal will of God. And that everything in creation really is an expression. What we can see is the primal will of God. What we can see is the paintbrush. So that theology actually becomes very important when we get to some issues, but that's how the Bab expressed what we experience when we come into, when we go through life. So the Bab said that everything in creation is actually spiritual in its essence, right? Including us. Everything in creation, we ourselves are a revelation of God, right? So this beautiful passage that is in a book written about the Bab, this is from his writings. He says, "Behold with the eye of thy heart, verily thy truth, the truth of thy being, is the divinity of thy Lord revealed unto thee and through thee. Thou art he himself, and he is thou thyself, except that indeed thou art that thou art, and he is that he is." So the revelation of God, though it exists in everything in creation, for us as humans, subjectively, what we experience is the revelation of God that exists within our own self. And that is the essence of who we are. The essence of who we are is tied to everything else that exists. And it's not God, but it's the revelation of God through us. So this very intimate sense of our relationship with God is a very powerful idea in the writings of the Bab. You can see why his religion was so powerful. But the Bab said something more than that. He said that revelation, if you will, is a general revelation. Everything experiences it. And every human being, if they look inward, will find that revelation of God that exists within them. But in order to develop humanity's spiritual capacities, God also reveals himself in a specific way. And that specific way is something we all know. It is the religions of humanity. Almost all of them were founded by a specific figure who claimed divine authority, right? Christ said, "I and the Father are one." And then other times he says, "My Father who art in heaven." He makes a distinction between himself and his Father. So how can that be? Well, this is a source of discussion in Christian communities for centuries. It's one of the major issues in Christianity is what was the nature of Christ's relationship to God? The Bab is in a sense telling us this question, but with his own perspective as a prophet, he's expressing to say that that Christ was the primal will of God. He was the paintbrush in creation. His will was the will of God as expressed to human beings. And so, and this is very significant because we're very significant. We have free will, we have rationality, we have independence. We can act with consciousness and so forth. When God reveals himself to us, it's different than when he reveals himself to an ant, right? Who doesn't have those qualities. The ant's just following the laws, right? We have free will. And so when a messenger of God brings the will of God to humanity, it's not only a big deal for us, it's a big deal for all of creation because we're part of nature too, right? So this is the majesty this is the reason that the writings, and you'll see this in a minute, speak with such majesty about this relationship. And the Bab said that all of these revelations, all of them, Christianity, Christ's revelation, the revelation of the Prophet Muhammad, all of the revelations that came before that they referenced, all of revelations that we don't even know about, All of them are an expression of the primal will, of the paintbrush of God within the creation of God's will. And that what God wants us to do in this day, in this period in history, is to see them all as one, to see beyond the superficial differences that reflect the historical circumstance of which they were revealed, and see them really all as expressions in history, as the expression of God. That's the pure waters of revelation that the Bab would refer to. And so the Bab would give many analogies in his writing, several different ones that are very illuminating to describe this relationship of the revelations of God, which reflect the paintbrush in all of creation. He says, verily the Son, speaking with the voice of God, the Bab says this, he says, verily the Son is but a token of my presence, meaning God's presence, so that my servants may discern in its rising and dawning of the dawning of every dispensation. Dispensation is a word that means revelation. So every time a messenger of God comes into the world, it's a new dispensation. And the Bab is saying that it's like the rising and setting of the sun. It's a natural process. And in fact, the sun is only a symbol. The sun is a symbol of that, to what happens to us in a spiritual realm when a new revelation comes into the world. And so the Bab explains so many of these theological concepts with quite power. And he says human beings have made a mistake. Human beings have seen these revelations as different when they should have seen them as expressions of one faith. And we have attached ourselves to the outer expressions of those revelations and forgotten and lost the inner beauty of them. That what makes a Christian respond to the words of Christ is that the words of Christ reflect the primal will of God. And we as human beings have a native primal relationship to to those words. It comes to us. That's why, you know, those individuals speaking on that podium, thanking Christ, they're responding to the primal will of God 2,000 years after it manifested itself in the world. And the differences in religions and the conflict between religions reflect the fact that people have basically taken the symbols and imagery of their religion and made them to be the God of the religion and not the essence of it. So this is a beautiful quote that the Bab says. In reference to various churches and mosques and symbols, this is of course in Israel at the Wailing Wall, which of course is juxtaposed to the Temple Mount, to the Dome of the Rock, a mosque. And there's always conflict between these. And then there's the Church of the Holy Sepulchre right there too, where a Christian shrine. He says, guard yourselves that you may not in any way be the cause of sadness to any soul, inasmuch as the hearts of the faithful are nearer to God than a house made of clay. He's telling us that human beings are more important than any house that represents God, because they're the most perfect reflection of the primal will of God, the most perfect expression. Beautiful idea, very powerful, very challenging, and revolutionary, no question. We can't shrink from these claims. These are very powerful things. So the essence of the Bab's religion, though, was to prepare the way for a figure that he called him whom God shall make manifest, or he whom God shall make manifest. It's in every chapter of his holy book. He gives a law in his religion, and he says the purposes of this law is so that you will believe in the one who will come after me, who he referred to as the one whom God shall make manifest. So what does that mean? It means the one that God is going to make obvious to everyone, right? As being the one that the Bab had foretold. And so the Bab said, listen, if you purify your heart, you will recognize him, because you will recognize the primal will immediately when he speaks his words, because it's a voice like no other voice. And so, and the Bab described his religion. He said this, he said, when the tree of my religion, which he referred to as the Bayan, this holy book was known as the Bayan. He says, when the tree of the Bayan attains its highest development, when my religion attains its highest development, we shall bend it low as a token of adoration towards its Lord, who will appear in the person of him whom God shall make manifest. Perchance you may be privileged to glorify God as befits his august self. Very powerful idea that his religion was built And then we'll, as a tree, the Bab uses this beautiful, I love the Bab and I could talk about him all day, but he gives this beautiful analogy of the revelations of God being like trees that start as a seed and then they grow. And then people seek shelter under their shade, under that tree. To get out from the perils of life, they come and shade under that tree. And that's one of the revelations of God, where Christians have been seeking shelter under the tree of Jesus. Muslims have been seeking shelter under the tree of the Prophet Muhammad. And the Bab says that when that tree gets old, a seed comes out of that tree and falls into the ground and forms a new tree. The new cycle of revelation is begun again. Bab has beautiful analogies. I can't even talk about them. They make me cry. But he says about his own religion, he says, we will bend it low. My tree will bend it low for him whom God shall make manifest. Extraordinarily powerful. I chose two passages from the writings of the Bab because I wanted to give you a sense as we think about, nobody helped us understand who Baha'u'llah is more than the Bab. And so I focused a little bit on him. This is a passage from the Bab. He says, if on the day of his revelation, meaning Baha'u'llah, all that are on earth bear him allegiance, my inmost being will rejoice, inasmuch as all will have attained the summit of their existence and will have been brought face to face with their beloved and will have recognized to the fullest extent attainable in the world of being the splendor of him who is the desire of their hearts. So very beautiful statement that the Bab says that the greatest joy that a human being can experience, the summit of their existence, is to believe in a manifestation of God when they come into the world, particularly in the time they come. Because he is the splendor of their innate desire of their hearts, what they're really seeking in life. I love this passage, and it's the same theme. The Bab says, there's no paradise more wondrous for any soul than to be exposed to God's manifestation in his day. Manifestation means messenger of God. It's the Bab's word for a messenger of God. There's no paradise more wondrous for any soul than to be exposed to God's manifestation in his day, to hear his verses and believe in him, to attain his presence, which is not but the presence of God. Remember, it's the paintbrush in the world of creation. It's the closest we can get to God. To sail upon the sea of the heavenly kingdom of his good pleasure, and to partake of the choice fruits of the paradise of his divine oneness. Very symbolic imagery, but just this idea that there's no paradise. The wonderful things you can experience in life, getting a promotion at a job, making more money, marrying the woman or man of your dreams, having your first child, as wonderful as these experiences are, there's no paradise that can be experienced greater than to come into the presence of a manifestation of God and to believe in that manifestation. So the Bab is preparing his community to experience Baha'u'llah through these types of words. You can imagine it was quite powerful. So in July of 1850, the Bab was suspended on that center post there and was executed by the Persian authorities at the behest and of the Islamic clergy with 750 rifles. And so his life ended at that moment. And yet he had created a community, 98% of whom would accept Baha'u'llah, that prepared them for that, using that marvelous language that we just saw in that last slide. The Bab's remains were eventually brought to the center, Baha'i World Center, where Baha'u'llah ended his exiles. And a beautiful shrine graces the slopes of Mount Carmel overlooking Haifa, Israel, in honor to his contribution to the faith of God and humanity's spiritual development. So I want to turn my attention back to Baha'u'llah. Baha'u'llah played a background role in the faith of the Bab as it was unfolding. And he was well respected and known to be a follower of the Bab. I didn't tell you the story of the Babs, of Baha'u'llah becoming a Babi or becoming a follower of the Bab, but the Bab sent him a tablet soon after his declaration, just a few months after. And Baha'u'llah opened it and closed it, looked to his brother to the right and said, whoever revealed the Quran has revealed these words. And it's obligatory on us all to accept them. And then Baha'u'llah became a leader in the background of that movement. After the Bab's execution, the leaders of the Bab's movement were similarly killed. All throughout Iran, there were efforts to kill them, and many of the leaders were killed. 3 years after the execution of the Bab, a young man disconsolate from the loss of the Bab decided to try and take a revenge on the Shah and try and shoot him, which he did, tried and shoot him. He didn't succeed. But the Shah, it raised the Shah's ire, and he decided to try and exterminate the community of the Bab's followers within his kingdom. And so mass persecution followed. And Baha'u'llah was caught up in that persecution and was taken from his home. He was in Tehran at the time, and he was taken from his home, and he was brought down. They rounded up anybody who was known to be a follower of the Bab. They rounded them all up, and they brought them down into this image, into this site. This is the looking up to the outside world, I assume, of what's known as the Black Pit. It was an old subterranean water basin that they turned into a dungeon. And it went down 3 flights. This was the only entrance. That was the only light that came into that space. And Baha'u'llah would spend 4 months in that prison, not knowing on a daily basis whether he would live or die. They would come down every day, almost every day, and take one of his fellow prisoners, one of the fellow Babis. They were known as Babis, followers of the Bab, and they would take them up and execute them. Baha'u'llah was not executed because he was such a well-respected individual. His own cousin was the prime minister. And it was proven over time that he had nothing to do with the attempt on the life of the Shah. And so Baha'u'llah was a bit of a special case. They really didn't know what to do with him. And so he spent 4 months down there watching his colleagues and comrades go up every day. And Baha'u'llah would teach them to sing. And they would sing every day, all day, to lift their spirits as they went through this horrific episode. Baha'u'llah had a chain around his neck that weighed 50 kilograms. So if you're an American like me, you don't really have a sense of what a kilo is. It's a lot of weight. 50 kilograms is a lot of weight. It's over 100 and some pounds, 110 or so pounds. So a few years ago, I went into the gym and I put 110 pounds of a free weight under my neck just to see what it would weigh. And I put it on there, and this is like the chain of Baha'u'llah that was around. And I was able to keep it there for a few minutes, and it got really uncomfortable. Baha'u'llah had that chain around his neck for 4 months. And when he came out of that dungeon, the marks of the chain had caused marks that were deep into his flesh, and he had those for the rest of his life. But it was in that environment that Baha'u'llah describes an episode of significance. And it's akin to when Moses went up to Mount Sinai and encountered the burning bush, which is on this slide, which is the symbol within Judaism, if you will, of the voice of God speaking to his messenger, right? Was a burning bush. And for Christians, they all know the story, or should know the story, of when John the Baptist was baptizing Christ. The heavens opened up, and a dove descended on Christ. And the heavens spoke, "This is my son, with whom I am well pleased." It was an announcement by God to the rest of creation, that a symbolic one, in which the vehicle of revelation, if you will, was a dove. coming down and alighting on Christ. And of course, the Prophet Muhammad described it as the angel Gabriel coming to him as the vehicle of his revelation. Baha'u'llah described a maiden. He says that when he was in the black pit, he says, while engulfed in tribulations, I heard a most wondrous, a most sweet voice calling above my head. Turning my face, I beheld a maiden, the embodiment of the remembrance of the name of my Lord, suspended in the air before me. Pointing her finger unto my head, she said, by God, this is the best beloved of the world, yet you comprehend not. This is the beauty of God among you, and the power of his sovereignty within you, could you but understand. It's very akin to the story of Christ, with the dove coming down, alighting on him, and the voice coming out of the clouds, this is my son with whom I am well pleased, right? Baha'u'llah is telling us the same thing. This is the best beloved of the world, yet you comprehend not. This is the beauty of God among you. So that we can't, Baha'u'llah, of course, is claiming then to be the messenger of God, the manifestation of the will of God to humanity. So Baha'u'llah was eventually released out of the black pit, and he was brought up to the surface. And, you know, these people came to him and said, oh, you know, we're so sorry that you, the various ministers and others said, we didn't realize it was you were down there. And of course it was all a lie. They were just trying to save face. And Baha'u'llah, they offered to take him to the prime minister, who was his cousin. And Baha'u'llah went before the prime minister. He insisted not to be changed in any way. He would go as he was, haggard and worn with wounds on him. And they engaged in a dialogue, and the prime minister asked him, you know, said, you should have never gotten involved with this religion of the Bab. You should have never. And Baha'u'llah said something in reply. And then prime minister said, what is it that you advise me now to do? And rather than look at himself or say anything about himself, Baha'u'llah said, command the governors of the realm to cease shedding the blood of the innocent, to cease plundering their property, to cease dishonoring their women and injuring their children. So his concern was not with himself, but with the others. And I just found that very powerful. So Baha'u'llah was then, the decision was made to exile him out of Iran, out of Persia, over the mountains. And after about 2 months that he was able to recover from his wounds, somewhat, he was still very ill, his family and some companions were forced to set out on a dangerous journey over these mountains. These are the exact mountains, and it was in the dead of winter, to the city of Baghdad, which lay on the other side of these mountains. And, you know, Baha'u'llah was still very ill. He couldn't even take solid food at the time they set out on the journey. There's stories of mostly his daughter saying what he experienced. But Baha'u'llah revealed a prayer at that time, and I just want to share it with you. He says, my God, my master, the throat thou hast accustomed to the touch of silk, thou hast in the end clasped with strong chains. And the body thou didst ease, and with brocades and velvets thou hast at last subjected to the abasement of a dungeon, until finally thy decree was irrevocably fixed, and thy behest summoned this servant to depart out of Persia, accompanied by a number of frail-bodied men and children of tender age, at this time when the cold is so intense that one cannot even speak, and ice and snow abundant that it is impossible to move. Baha'u'llah, throughout his writings, shares with us his suffering. He tells us, this hurts. He has prayers telling God, this really hurts. And I think the reason he does that is because he wants us to know that life is hard, but he also is teaching us, I believe, that you know, we can find comfort in God, and that because that's how he did. And he's really teaching us through that. I love that story and that prayer. So Baha'u'llah then was brought over the mountains, and so he came from Tehran to Baghdad. And Baghdad at this time was the provincial capital of the Ottoman Empire. It had one time been one of the most remarkable places in the world. The 11th century, Baghdad was the most advanced place in the world. But at this point, it was the provincial capital. It was still a reasonably sized city. And of course, it's now the capital of modern Iraq, and Baghdad is a major city. Baha'u'llah was able to freely move in the city. He wasn't a prisoner at this point. He was able to move around. But what had happened, unfortunately, is that the Bab community, because all of their leaders had been killed and the Bab had been killed, and then there was this episode where somebody had tried to shoot the Shah, they had gotten persecuted, they were really in a sorry state. And there was a lot of dissension amongst them about what to do next. And Baha'u'llah, of course, knew that he was the manifestation of God. He knew that he was the one that the Bab had foretold. And so rather than get involved in all this dissension, Baha'u'llah decided to retire to the mountains. And so he went north by himself, well, with a companion, but really by himself, initially with a companion. And then once he got up there, he was mostly by himself. And he was in these mountains for 2 years, living basically outside of society. He describes this, he says, alone we communed with our spirit, oblivious of the world and all that is therein. He was a 3 days journey from just to even a village to get provisions. So he was really quite remote, and it was at least a year that he was up in these mountains. He was 2 years in the mountains, at least a year on his own. And he describes this as the most peaceful time in his life. He was very sad and describes that as well, but his soul was overjoyed because of his relationship to God. There's some imagery that Baha'u'llah uses, again, expressing these ideas. And there's an interesting story about how Baha'u'llah came back. He had gone into the town to get provisions, and he was sitting there, and a young boy came running past who was crying and tearful and so forth. And Baha'u'llah stopped him. He said, "Why are you crying?" And the young boy said, "I have lost my homework, basically. I've lost my copy. My instructor, my teacher, one of the religious teachers in the town had given me this copy that I was supposed to use to do my homework, and I was supposed to copy it to do calligraphy and also to learn how to read and write. This is how he did it." He said, "And I've lost it." So Baha'u'llah said, "I will teach you. I will find it. I will redo your copy. What did he ask you to learn?" And Baha'u'llah wrote it out for him. And the boy went off very happy that he had this. So when the boy went into the class and the teacher saw what he had, he said, "Who wrote this?" And he said, "This holy man I met." And the man said, "This is exquisite. The writing was exquisite. The language was exquisite." So he looked for Baha'u'llah and found him, and invited him to get, he wanted to get to know Baha'u'llah, to find how he had come to be so noble. And so Baha'u'llah, soon after, people would come to him with questions. And so soon after, he became very famous in this area as a very learned and knowledgeable holy man that everyone came to respect a great deal. And what happened is the community of the family of Baha'u'llah back in Baghdad heard of this person, and they knew it must be him. And so they sent up someone to come, an emissary. Baha'u'llah greeted them and said, "Yes, it's time for me to come back." And so Baha'u'llah came back to Baghdad. And at this point, the dissension had all played itself out. Everybody was desperate for him to come back. And he began to really reform the community of the Bab, mostly through his own efforts, over tea. He would go to the tea houses. He would invite others for tea. But the atmosphere in Baha'u'llah's home was an atmosphere of such beautiful spirituality that the governor would come, the princes who were traveling from Persia would come to be with Baha'u'llah because it was such a beautiful place. One of Baha'u'llah's followers wrote a history of the Baha'i faith, and he described it. And he referred to Baha'u'llah's house as the most great house. He says the room of the most great house was set apart for the reception of Baha'u'llah's visitors. Though it was dilapidated and having long since overgrown its usefulness, it vied with the most exalted paradise. So he's saying it's a dilapidated place, but to us it was like paradise. Low roofed, it seemed to reach to the stars. And though it boasted but a single couch fashioned from the branches of palms, it drew to itself, even as a lodestone, even as a magnet, the hearts of princes. So people would come from all different walks of life to talk with Baha'u'llah, to sit on this couch, and it's remarkable how his fame grew because of his own qualities. At one point, he was visited by princes that had come from Persia, and Baha'u'llah was engaging them in conversation, and he wasn't talking about spiritual things because he didn't think they were interested. And he said, why do you talk about spiritual things with these other people that come, but to us you just talk about the affairs of the day? And Baha'u'llah said, and then they asked him, so what is your cause? Why are you here? What are you trying to achieve? And Baha'u'llah said something really interesting. He said, do you know what my purpose is in coming to this world and proclaiming my cause among the people? He says, I have come to establish openly, through the strength and power of God, justice, protection, trustworthiness, piety in every corner of this world, which is so replete with defilement, in which the oppression of the oppressors and the treachery of the treacherous have sealed the door of tranquility to all creation. He says, do you know what kind of world I want to build? He said, I shall establish it in such wise that a woman secluded behind a veil, to a ray of whose beauty even the sun itself would fail to compare, a woman adorned with every precious gem. She can step out from behind that veil with manifest splendor and travel alone, without guardian or escort, through the uttermost corners of the east to the uttermost corners of the west. The state of trustworthiness, piety, equity, and justice, free of any treachery, baseness, injustice, and oppression, will be such that not a single rapacious hand would stretch out to encroach upon her riches, nor would one look of perfidy and perversity upon her beauty. Indeed, with a heart unsullied and a countenance filled with joy, she would conclude her journey through every land and return to her native home. This is the kind of world, these are the kinds of qualities that Baha'u'llah seeks to build in people. And you can imagine, in this time, women were all veiled and so forth because they were to attract men and so forth. And Baha'u'llah saying a woman would remove her veil and put on the most beautiful of jewels and walk through the world from the east to the west. And not a person, there would be such a sense of trustworthiness that this woman would never fear for her safety. It's a beautiful and important statement. And so Baha'u'llah was really educating this community through these teachings. He says that it behooves the loved ones of God to be forbearing towards their fellow men, to be so sanctified and detached from all things, and to evince such sincerity and fairness that all the peoples of the earth may recognize him as the trustees of God amongst men. This is the kinds of qualities Baha'u'llah was trying to develop. So within Baghdad, Baha'u'llah revealed 3 significant texts, and we're going to be going over these and using passages from these in our podcast, so we'll get into it. But I want to just briefly review. The first is the Book of Certitude, which was actually revealed in honor, in response to questions of the uncle of the Bab himself, who had not come to believe in the Bab, but had questions. And his questions were the same questions that many Christians and many Muslims have today. How could somebody claim to be a prophet of God? Our scriptures tell us that when that happens, it will be obvious to everyone that the mountains will fold together, that the heavens will fall upon the earth, the sun shall come out of the sky. All of these things, literal things will happen. How could it possibly be true that that is the case? So in answer to those kinds of questions, Baha'u'llah revealed this absolutely majestic work. It was revealed only in 48 hours. When you read it, it's over 200 pages. When you read it, you can't believe it was revealed so quickly. It's a majestic and eloquent work. But Baha'u'llah describes the revelations of God similar to the Bab. In fact, it's really in many ways the second part of the Bab's teaching. The Bab left his holy book unfinished. And the Book of Certitude is supposed to be the completion of that. He said that him whom God shall make manifest will finish it. And then we believe that this is that. But Baha'u'llah, in describing the manifestations of God, he says every one of them is the way of God that connects this world with the realms above and the standard of his truth unto everyone in the kingdoms of earth and heaven. They are the manifestations of God amidst men, the evidence of his truth and the signs of his glory. Continuing the theme that the Bab had started, that all the revelations of God are from the same source, and either one of them is the way of God. I'm going to highlight these quickly because I can see I'm getting a little light on time. The Call of Divine Beloved is a lovely book that has been published recently that collects some of the writings that Baha'u'llah wrote to some of the mystics who had come out of the mountains down to visit him. And the mystical Islam is gorgeous, and Baha'u'llah adopts some of that language and the poetry and expressing it. And in this book is The Seven Valleys, which is a famous book in which Baha'u'llah describes the journey of a human soul to God. Beautiful descriptions, you know, and this is a quote from that Seven Valleys, in which Baha'u'llah describes how every soul is really seeking God. And that at a certain stage of spiritual development, you see the world this way, that you really see everything that people do are really, they're actually seeking God. And he says, how many a lover will he behold hastening towards the well-beloved? He will see a world of adoring souls witnessing, and who will he witness that are tracing the path of the adored one. So I see this a lot in my life, and how people are really looking for God to fulfill themselves, and they look for other things, drugs and other things, but what they're really looking for is that kind of relationship that Baha'u'llah is telling us about. The third book that was revealed during this period, all of this, by the way, all of these were revealed before Baha'u'llah had formally declared his mission. But the third book is a majestic work that I encourage you all to absolutely just go out and buy right now. It's on Amazon. In which Baha'u'llah, through very short statements, speaking with the voice of God directly to the human soul. There's no other book in the history of in the history of the world's religion that is like this. And Baha'u'llah describes these short teachings that he reveals as being the inner essence of the revelations of the past. The preamble to the book is right here. It says, "This is that which hath descended from the realm of glory, uttered by the tongue of power and might, and revealed unto the prophets of old. We have taken the inner essence thereof and clothed it in the garment of brevity, that as a token of grace unto the righteous, that they may stand faithful to the covenant of God, may fulfill in their lives his trust, and in the realm of spirit obtain the gem of divine virtue." Most Baha'is, I think, because we read the hidden words so often, probably memorize it. It's absolutely wonderful. I call to mind a hidden word all the time. It's unbelievable. We published on Sifter of Dust one of the hidden words, just to give you a feel for it. God speaks to humanity, he says, "Oh, emigrants, you're traveling. We're all traveling in a spiritual path, right? The tongue I have designed for the mention of me, the mention of God. Defile it not with detraction." Detraction meaning criticism or backbiting. "If the fire of self overcomes you, remember your own faults and not the faults of my creatures, inasmuch as every one of you knoweth his own self better than he knoweth others." So you'll see these ethical teachings in this wonderful book. So really what books are about, and really all of Baha'u'llah's revelation, but these books in particular are about the love of God. And if you don't know what the love of God is, and you haven't felt it in your life, you should read these books, because you will begin to appreciate it, because that's really all that they're about. You know, Christ said the greatest commandment was that thou shalt love thy God with all thy heart, with all thy soul, and with all thy mind. And then the second greatest was to love your neighbor as yourself, right? So Baha'u'llah says the same thing. And a lot of these writings are intended to ignite that love within us. At the end of the Seven Valleys, when someone has traversed these paths, these spiritual travails, and has reached the union with God, Baha'u'llah says that the true lover and devoted friend reaches the presence of the beloved. When that happens, the radiant beauty of the loved one and the fire of the lover's heart will kindle ablaze and burn away all veils and wrappings. Yea, all that he hath, from marrow to skin, will be set aflame, so that nothing will remain save the friend, meaning God. So, you know, this is a way of thinking about the love of God that a lot of Westerners are not used to. This intimacy, this intimate relationship with God that you can have. And then, you know, what religion is really about, Baha'u'llah tells us, is making this connection, developing the spirit of the love of God, and then manifesting that love to everyone around you. And when you do this, you act differently. your relationships are no longer transactional. You do this for me, I'll do that for you. You're acting in a more noble plane. Your actions are out of love. And you don't want reward anymore, because your reward is the love you feel of doing the act, because your loved one is one that you carry with you all the time. This is the kind of life that Baha'u'llah is trying to open up to us. And these books will give you a sense of that. So going back to the garden, Baha'u'llah in 1863 was being exiled further out of Baghdad. He had become too famous. Basically, he was too close to Persia. The Persians didn't want him so close. There were too many people who were that were coming under his influence. Even the governor of the Ottoman Empire in that area was in love with Baha'u'llah. He was too close. They needed him further away. So they wanted to exile him further away, and they conspired with the Ottoman authorities to do that. But before leaving Baghdad, Baha'u'llah gathered his followers in this garden outside and formally declared that his mission had started. And the language in which Baha'u'llah describes this is really remarkable. He says things like this. He says, "This is the day." And the day is capitalized. It's not like it's just today, right? It's like the era, the time in history. He says, "This is the day wherein the ocean of God's mercy has been manifested unto men. The day in which the day star of his loving kindness have shed its radiance upon them. The day in which his bountiful favor has overshadowed the whole of mankind. Now is the time to refresh the downcast through the invigorating breeze of love and fellowship and the living waters of friendliness and charity." So this time of Baha'u'llah's revelation was a period of joy and absolute exuberance. When Baha'u'llah left Baghdad, the people lined the streets because they were so enamored with him personally. Many of them didn't even know that he had made this claim. They just loved who he was and what he had come to represent. His claim, but Baha'u'llah says, in that day, his revelation began. And the impact on all of creation, he says, would be felt. I'm getting a little bit long on time, so I'm not going to be able to go all of that. But this is another quote that says, you know, "This is the day in which God's most excellent favors have been poured out, a new revelation coming into the world. It is incumbent upon all the peoples of the world to reconcile their differences, and with perfect unity and peace, abide beneath the shadow of the tree of his care and loving kindness." Remember that analogy of the Bab, that the revelations are like the place we seek shelter, right? We find our salvation within those things. And Baha'u'llah says it's the tree of his care and loving kindness. So Baha'u'llah was exiled further, initially to the center, what is now Istanbul, to Constantinople, and then a little further away to Adrianople. And it's at this time that, now that he had announced his mission to his followers, it was at this time that he announced it to the rest of the world. And he did that through tablets to the kings and rulers of the world. These are among the most remarkable works in the history of religion. They're very powerful. And Baha'u'llah begins in these tablets to lay out his vision, what the vision and teachings of his revelation. And he says, "Lay not aside the fear of God, O kings of the earth." This is to the kings of the earth collectively. By the way, on the left is Nasruddin Shah. It's Pope Pius IX next to Queen Victoria in the middle. One of these is Napoleon. The other is Kaiser Wilhelm, and I've forgotten which. So Baha'u'llah addresses to them all. And he says, "Be vigilant that you do not injustice to anyone, be it to the extent of a grain of mustard seed. Tread you the path of justice, for this is the straight path. Compose your differences and reduce your armaments. Heal the dissensions that divide you, that you will no longer be in need of armaments except that what the protection of your cities and territories demands." This is one short passage that I was able to fit on the slide to all the kings and rulers of the earth. There are many more. Baha'u'llah was very powerful, but I wanted you to get a sense of the language he uses. This was a very powerful one. You know, Baha'u'llah wrote a tablet to the Pope announcing his claim. It was at that time Pope Pius IX, which was the last Pope to have secular authority. and to run a kingdom. And it was a very wealthy kingdom. And it was after him that the Vatican became lost its worldly sovereignty, if you will. But at this point, this Pope was particularly worldly in his perspective. But I want you to get a feel for this claim of Baha'u'llah. It's magnificent. I mean, he's talking to the Pope. The Pope is the leader of the Catholic Church. The Catholic Church is the largest religious institution in the world. And Baha'u'llah is giving him spiritual guidance, right? So this is the sense in which, the voice with which he speaks. And he gives him a spiritual lesson. He says, "O Supreme Pontiff, consider a pearl which shines by virtue of its inherent nature." He's giving an analogy to a human being, which shines because of our inherent natures of who we are. We're like pearls. He said, if it's covered with silk, its luster and beauty will be concealed. Likewise, man's distinction lies in the excellence of his conduct and the pursuit of that which beseems his station, not in childish play and pastimes. And he says to the Pope, know that thou true endowment is not silk robes and expensive jewelry. It consists in the love of God and in that attachment from him, and not in those luxuries. Abandon them to those who want them, and turn unto God who causes the rivers to flow. I mean, these are remarkable tablets, friends. I can't describe it any differently. If you've never heard of Baha'u'llah before and you're hearing these for the first time, it's a big deal. I can't tell you. When I read these, I was shocked. It's a big deal. But these people were not in a situation that they would listen to the wisdom of Baha'u'llah, because these leaders were imperialists, all of them, and they were trying to feed the industrial machines that they had created. They needed more land, they needed more resources, they needed more free labor. So they were trying to conquer the world. And so Napoleon is said to have said, if he is God, I am two gods. These were pompous, arrogant souls. Who Baha'u'llah said that they were so filled with pride, they couldn't even recognize their own advantage, let alone recognize his revelation. And they were creating havoc around the world. You had the Zulu Wars in Africa. The French were trying to conquest Algeria. Russians doing their thing. The Opium Wars, where Britain was trying to preserve their role in the opium trade. They wanted the opium trade, narcotics, the narcotic trade for themselves. So they conquered the Chinese and took Hong Kong. This is what these leaders were engaged in. And America was not spared. America had its own imperialist ideas. This is in the mid-1800s, right? After the Civil War, 1863 is when the Emancipation Proclamation came out. After the Civil War, America began its expansion out to the West, displacing the Native Americans who lived there, doing its own imperialism because they needed more land and they needed more resources. And of course, slavery was still going on until 1863. This is a photograph of a painting highlighting the Underground Railroad. The world was not in a state to recognize Baha'u'llah's revelation. It was really, even though it was said to the kings of that time, it's really almost said for us. But in those tablets, Baha'u'llah tells us what he expects of us. He says the time must come when the imperative necessity for holding a vast and all-embracing assemblage of men will be universally realized. The rulers and the kings of the earth must needs attend it, and in participating in its deliberations must consider such ways and means as will lay the foundation of the world's great peace among men. And then Baha'u'llah gives us a new vision in this same tablet. This is to the kings. He said, that one indeed is a man who dedicates himself to the service of the entire human race. Blessed and happy is he that arises to promote the best interest of the peoples and kindreds of the earth. It is not for him to pride himself who loves his own country, but rather for him who loves the world. The earth is but one country, and mankind its citizens. Friends, this is the middle of the 19th century, and we are living now a century and a half beyond this, and we're just coming to these values, seeing the world as one country. The light of men is justice, quench it not with the contrary winds of oppression and tyranny. The purpose of justice is the appearance of unity. So we have in our writings of the Baha'i Faith this spectacular and deep passages like this that tell us about the nature of the human race and how we can achieve peace. It's the first revelation, really, that has taken this world perspective and is explicitly teaching us to see the world as one human family. But Baha'u'llah was not naive. He knew that we were going to need to go through some difficulties in order to achieve this. He said, the world is in despair and its agitation waxes day by day. Its perversity will long continue, he says. And then in other passages, he said, the winds of despair are blowing from every direction. He said, the signs of impending convulsions and chaos can now be discerned, inasmuch as the prevailing order appears to be lamentably defective. You couldn't make a peaceful world out of the ideas and ideals of the 19th century. And so those ideals and values that were expressed in imperialism and everything else put the world at war, 2 world wars. After which we began to think about Baha'u'llah's ideas, right? A vast assemblage of men will be universally realized to lay the foundation of the world's great peace among men. This is the United Nations. It's a start. We're not there yet, but humanity had to go through 2 world wars to get to a teaching that they could have accepted from Baha'u'llah from the beginning. And we suffered immensely because we ignored it. But it was a wonderful moment when the UN was formed, and it has spurred a sense of solidarity around the world, a vision of ourselves around the world. Many organizations have been formed really inspired by this vision of the world being one family, and we need to care for others beyond our borders. And so a phoenix, this is the painting that is in the UN General Assembly, a phoenix rising from the ashes. But we're in doing this, we are following the teachings of the revelation of God for humanity for this day. There's an easier way to do this than go through 2 world wars and what other tragedies we're going to experience coming forward. You know, Baha'u'llah's vision, I think, needs to be placed within the context of some of the other visions of the 19th century. You know, Nietzsche was born in 1844, the German philosopher who claimed that God is dead. 1844 was the time the Bab revealed the revelation that Baha'u'llah was coming into the world. I always found that very ironic. The survival of the fittest was Darwin's idea, which was then applied to, this was the idea of the imperialists. We're the fittest. We are going to survive. We will fight with everyone, and whoever survives is the best. Stalin said this, there is no place for the weak. The weak crumble and are slaughtered and are erased from history, while the strong for good or for ill survive, right? And religion wasn't giving any answers to these questions. So this is a particular view of human beings, a view of human beings that was very prominent in the 19th century and the 20th century, and still permeates our institutions, by the way, or even our academic institutions, right? Because materialism is part and parcel of these ideas, right? That we are animals, fundamentally, as human beings. The fruits of those ideas were the 2 world wars we experienced. Baha'u'llah had a different view of human beings. He said, to act like animals is unworthy of a human being. Those virtues that befit his dignity are forbearance, mercy, compassion, and loving kindness towards all the peoples and kindreds of the earth, right? So Baha'u'llah is asking us to use our transcendent ideals to raise up to what we are supposed to be, and then express those transcendent ideals in our societies. It's a completely different framing. In the hidden words, Baha'u'llah, with the voice of God, says, noble have I created thee, but you've abased yourself. Rise unto that for which thou wast created. Baha'u'llah's revelation is seeking to transform human hearts, to recognize their nobility and their honor, and express that, develop it in love of all humanity and the building of a new world civilization. So Baha'u'llah was not down necessarily on everything too. He also knew that there was enormous potential in the world at that time, and still is. He says the whole earth is in a state of pregnancy. The day is approaching when it will have yielded its noblest fruits, when from it will have sprung forth the loftiest trees, the most enchanting blossoms, and the most heavenly blessings. And this is Baha'u'llah's miracle. So in one of his early tablets after his revelation, he told us that this will happen. He said, ere long we shall bring into exponents of new and wondrous sciences, of potent and effective crafts, and shall make manifest through them that which none of our servants have conceived. Nobody at that time of history could imagine, he said, the new and wondrous sciences that would come into the world. And look at this graph. I'm sure this is something I pulled off the internet, but it's cool. It's so amazing. You know, the telegraph right there was May 23rd, 1844 was the day that Samuel Morse sent the message on the first telegraph. That was the day that the Bab declared his mission. Look what's happened since then. So Baha'u'llah tells us that when a revelation of God comes into the world, it's like global warming. It causes more energy to exist in the atmosphere and manifests itself in many ways. It may cause more water, more hurricanes, more floods. It may cause more fires because of drought and dryness. But it's just an infusion of energy, right? And so of warmth. What Baha'u'llah is saying is that a revelation of God is like that to the world, and that we're experiencing that, but not in the material realm, but in a spiritual way, with our intellectual development, with our spiritual development, with the growth of our values. The values of the 19th century don't fit our world anymore. Right? We need new values. And that's what Baha'u'llah is here to supply us with. Amazing statements of Baha'u'llah says, we shall cause wisdom to spread among the people. So looking at the kings and leaders of his time, none of them made it out. None of those kings made it out of the 19th century. None of their empires made it out of the 19th century. All of those were dissolved, except for the British, except for Queen Victoria. Baha'u'llah said, from two ranks of men is power seized, kings and priests. Look at what's happened to the decline of priestly institutions since the 19th century. So Baha'u'llah is telling us that we're going through a transition, friends, in this world. He describes it as an old order being rolled up and a new one being spread out. And, you know, Baha'is, from these statements of Baha'u'llah and from other things that we know and have been explained to us, the world is really going through this passage of whenever something new happens, something has to be destroyed. So, you know, when we're seeing the decline of older institutions that we loved and that were very important for humanity, we're seeing the democratization of knowledge, the democratization of spirituality, with priests becoming less important, the democratization of everything. Wisdom is spreading among the people, right? People are on the streets wanting what their leaders can't bring them, right? Because they know what the world is that emerging is one in which we need to treat each other with love and respect all over the world. So I don't have time probably to go through all of these quotes, but this beautiful quote is Baha'u'llah saying to shut your eyes to estrangement, fix your gaze upon unity. He tells us that the world is just one homeland and habitation. And in the estimation of his followers, he says, man's glory is in his knowledge, his upright conduct, his praiseworthy character, his wisdom, not his nationality or rank. None of these things are meaningful. And so Baha'u'llah was then exiled further after announcing his mission to the kings and further explaining these. Ultimately, his influence grew and grew and grew, and finally they decided him to, the Ottoman and the Persian empires decided to send him where they thought he couldn't be heard from again. The remotest outpost prison colony they could think of. And it was on the banks of the Mediterranean in an old Crusade fortress city known as Akka. And they imprisoned Baha'u'llah there, brought him by boat with his family and some companions. And this was a real imprisonment. This was in a prison cell. And when they arrived, they got off the boat and they weren't given food, and what they were given in terms of water was undrinkable. And it was a harsh imprisonment being foisted upon them. Baha'u'llah, some of Baha'u'llah's followers had refused to leave his side, refused to go, and so they chose voluntarily to be imprisoned with him. And 2 of those followers died within a week or 2 of them arriving because of the conditions. They were so sick. And they wanted to bury their bodies, and the guards wouldn't bury the bodies unless they received a bribe. And so they had a carpet that was sold, and they were able to finally bury these men. And the guards threw them in a shallow grave. I mean, a very harsh imprisonment. And this was the prison cell that Baha'u'llah was thrown into. It's been renovated now for pilgrimage for Baha'is, but you can sense what it must have been like. Baha'u'llah would spend over a decade here. Harsh imprisonment to the manifestation of God to humanity for this time in history. And Baha'u'llah wrote back to the prime minister who had imprisoned him here. And he said, he told him a story, and it's a parable, and it's really a beautiful parable, and I want to spend a few minutes on it. I know I'm running late, I'm sorry. It's hard to tell the story of Baha'u'llah in shortness. I hope you all don't mind. But he told him a story of when he was a young man and his brother had gotten married, Baha'u'llah's own brother, and they had a feast for his brother. And as part of that, there was a puppet show. And that puppet show was meant to represent the play that they played out in the puppet show was a king who was looking over his court. And at one point in the puppet show, Baha'u'llah tells us that it turns out there's an outbreak of revolt, and the king sends the troops out there, and then there's another pompous ceremony that happens and so forth. And this whole puppet show plays out with this king in his court dealing with the things of the day, all caught up in the pomposity of it. And then Baha'u'llah says later on, after the event had ended, he sees this man walking out with a box. And he says, "What's in the box?" And that's where this side starts. I said, "What's in the box?" I asked him, "What's the nature of this display?" And the man says, all of that puppet show, all that lavish display and these elaborate devices, the king, the princes, their might and their power, everything you saw is contained in that box. In this box I carry under my arm. And Baha'u'llah says, ever since that day, all the trappings of the world had seemed in the eyes of this youth akin to the same spectacle. They have never been, nor will they ever be, of any weight or consequence, be it to the extent of a grain of mustard seed. How greatly I marveled that men should pride themselves on such vanities, while those possessed of insight, ere they witness any evidence of human glory, perceive with certainty the inevitability of its waning. Baha'u'llah is trying to teach us to have a spiritual understanding, to see the world as a show, and to not get caught up in it, right? Because in the end, it all goes into a box, right? The whole show, in 50 years, nobody's going to even remember. After I die, nobody's going to even remember who I was, right? And that's a harsh reality. We don't say it out loud because nobody wants to hear it, but it's true. And he's telling us, don't set your affections on this world, your names, your titles, any of this stuff. He said, it behooves everyone to traverse this brief span of life with sincerity and fairness. Should one fail to attain the recognition of him who is the eternal truth, let him at least conduct himself with reason and justice. These outward trappings, before long, these outward trappings, these visible treasures, these overweening souls, are all shall pass into the confines of the grave as though into that box. In the eyes of those possessed of insight, all this conflict, contention, and vainglory has ever been and will ever be like unto the play and pastimes of children. So Baha'u'llah is telling this story, and who knows if it's true, but he's telling us the story in order to help us understand and distinguish between the transient and the eternal, right? And if we do that, and we choose the eternal and love the eternal and fall in love with the eternal, we become like those people he describes that allow that woman to walk throughout the world without even people looking at her in an awkward way.
But there's another thing I want to point out in this passage. I want to focus on this one line that says, should one fail to attain unto the recognition of him who is the eternal truth, let him at least conduct himself with reason and justice. You know, we make distinctions in our modern society between the secular and the religious, or the secular and the sacred. And our secular society, our civil society around the world operates, I think, the two qualities that probably could describe the values of that society are reason and justice. And Baha'u'llah is telling us that that's good, that's wonderful, right? That's a part of spiritual growth as well, is to have a society and have a person operate with reason and justice. There's no, there's nothing wrong with that, right? But that's a stage to a higher level of understanding as well, a spiritual understanding that Baha'u'llah refers to as recognition of him who is the eternal truth. And I'm sure also that means recognition of his claims. But so in that sense, he's also saying, if you don't accept my claims, at least conduct yourself with reason and justice. I thought that was a very powerful idea. So in the writings of Baha'u'llah, there's not this distinction that we often make in our minds, and we segregate the world into the secular and to sacred. I've noticed this many times, and it's been striking to me as I read the writings of Baha'u'llah. All of reality is sacred. All of reality in Baha'u'llah's description is spiritual. Everything that we experience is a spiritual world. And so there's really not these differences in reality that exist that we make in our minds. There's a similar idea, I think, in how we think about science and religion, that we look at the world from a scientific perspective and we break it down to its component parts, and we call that nature. And there are naturalistic explanations for things. A lot of the difficulties that religion had in justifying itself against the modern science was that there didn't seem to be any room for religion anymore because science was explaining everything. So the things that might have been attributed to gods in the past were now understood through natural processes, right, that we all have come to know. And so a lot of scientists have become atheists or agnostics on this basis of this one simple thinking. What Baha'u'llah tells us, though, is that we have framed nature itself as a material entity, but it's not in reality. In reality, the natural laws that exist are an expression of God's will. And so he says this in a very powerful and important passage. He says, and I'm going to focus on the middle part of that passage, he says, nature is God's will and its expression in and through the contingent world. The contingent world is our world, the world that's dependent on things that happened before. So everything that happens to us is dependent on things that happened before. It's a world of cause and effect. It's a contingent world. So nature is God's will expressed through that. So there is no distinction here. And this is a very, very powerful idea. And I think in many ways, it's a foundational idea for the reconciliation of science and religion. That nature itself, the laws of gravity, are an expression of God's will. I want to point out this, just a theological point, this first part of the passage where Baha'u'llah says, nature in its essence is in the embodiment of my name, the maker, the creator. And later on he said, it is a dispensation of providence ordained by the ordainer, the all-wise. So you say, what does he mean by that? What does he mean by it being the expression of a name, right? So remember that, the Bab and Baha'u'llah have taught us that everything in creation reflects the qualities of God. And so there are these infinite names of God that you can talk about because they express a different aspect of God. So Baha'u'llah, speaking with the voice of God, says nature in its essence is the embodiment of my quality, of that quality of God that makes and creates. So it's a beautiful way of looking at the world because it makes everything around you spiritual. There's not this actual distinction. Everything in creation is sacred, and every person in creation is sacred. So Baha'u'llah would spend the greater portion of the rest of his life in this prison. And I wanted to tell you a little bit about how his faith spread from here. Despite this being a remote colony, prison colony, Baha'u'llah would receive pilgrims from Iran, from Persia, and other places, but mostly Persia. And there were thousands of the Bab's followers who converted to, accepted Baha'u'llah's claim and converted to the Baha'i faith. And Baha'u'llah continued over the time that he was in the prison to communicate with them. And the way the system worked is his followers would walk for 1,000 miles. It is over 1,000 miles from Tehran to the city of Akka. I think it's like 1,160 miles or something. So a journey that would take months. You can imagine what, you can walk about 10 miles a day, and it's 1,000 miles, so it's going to take you at least 100 days, but then of course you have to find a place to stay and to sleep and so forth. So people would walk, it would take months. Early in his imprisonment, they could only see his hand from the wave from the prison window. They couldn't even go in to see him. But later on, after things were relaxed, they could actually come and they would spend a couple of months in the presence, in the environments of Baha'u'llah, and come and were able to see him. But what would happen is that Baha'u'llah would reveal tablets, each for the little villages that existed along the way, and sometimes individuals within those villages that would have questions for him, and maybe transmitted a question to him, and he would reveal a tablet back. And in this way, the literature that we have of Baha'u'llah's revelation has been built up. There are thousands of tablets. And these have been translated, and some of them are very small, and some of them deal with very local issues. But in every single one of them, he speaks with the same majestic voice. He speaks with the voice of God. It's amazing, really. But that's, if you can imagine, it's not like the internet, right? So, or even the days when we have fax machines, right? Every tablet that Baha'u'llah would reveal would be copied, and then it would be shared in these villages along the way, and oftentimes these villages would get their own. But because of this system, there's a fair amount of redundancy of the themes in Baha'u'llah's tablets, because, you had to make, he had to address multiple things. So there's a fair amount of redundancy in the questions that were asked and what he revealed. So we have in English, we believe, the major features of Baha'u'llah's revelation, but all the time there are little scraps of things that come out that are just absolutely wonderful, and so consistent with everything we have in English. But the devotion of these people who were under extreme persecution all the time, how they would meet oftentimes before dawn, so they wouldn't be seen, and they would read these tablets of Baha'u'llah. And these communities became ignited, and they were spreading their religion even though they were under severe persecution. Everything they were doing was illegal. Even in Baha'u'llah's tablets, he very rarely mentions the name of a specific individual. He'll refer to them in an oblique way, because if somebody were to get that tablet, they would be able to figure out who was his follower, and they could persecute them. So he was protecting his own followers. Remarkable thing. So, I wanted to share with you just a couple of passages. This picture on the left is really the landscape in Iraq that people would have to walk over to see Baha'u'llah. But I was struck by a couple things. It's very human. It's very beautiful. A woman apparently had written to Baha'u'llah concerned about her appearance, for instance, right? And he writes back to her. He said, "Oh, my handmaid," which is Baha'u'llah would refer to his women followers. Men were generally servants, women were handmaidens. He says, "Oh, my handmaid, concern not thyself with that which is outwardly apparent. Fix thy gaze rather on that which lies within. Look thou upon the beauty of God's loved ones with his eye. Should one not be possessed of an attractive appearance, know thou that inwardly they possess a beauty that arouses the envy of every beloved one. Physical beauty is loved by self and passion, while spiritual beauty is loved by God. Which then which thou choose? So the beautiful, just a simple, intimate idea, right? That the beauty that God's loves is what's within, not the outer appearances, right? Another passage, which is very tagged on the end of one of Baha'u'llah's tablets that deals with some very majestic themes, is this one little paragraph that it always strikes me. He's writing this tablet back and deals with all these themes, but there's also this individual, Hussein, who's apparently done something bad. And Baha'u'llah says, you have mentioned Hussein. And then he expresses how Hussein has been forgiven for what he has done. He says, we have attired his temple with the robe of forgiveness and adorned his head with the crown of pardon. Be not despondent. After the revelation of this blessed verse, it is as though thou hast been born anew from thy mother's womb, right? So, you know, there was a big deal made in the Gospels about Jesus' claim to be able to forgive sins. And of course, that's what Baha'u'llah is doing, right? He's saying, forget what happened in the past. From this moment forward, you have been born anew from your mother's womb, and go forward. We see this again and again in Baha'u'llah's tablets, urging people to come back to the baseline and move forward, always focusing on their spiritual progress. Beautiful, beautiful and intimate and just lovely. So there we go. So Baha'u'llah would send tablets to these communities, encouraging them to spread his faith and to share it with others. This is a passage from a tablet to one of the communities, one of the smaller communities. He says, service to the Almighty is teaching his cause, but guiding the people has been and will continue to be achieved by pure and goodly deeds performed in a spirit of compassion and love. And through this mechanism, through the sharing of Baha'u'llah's words and his teachings, there were thousands more people who became Baha'is in the time of his lifetime, expanding from the religion of the Bab. Most of his early followers, not all, but most of the early followers of the Bab were Muslim, right? There were actually some Jews who became followers of the Bab, and there were some Hindus as well, but most of them were Muslim. In Baha'u'llah's time, it began to spread out. And so there were actually several whole villages of Jews who became Baha'is. And there's some beautiful tablets of Baha'u'llah to these Jewish communities. There are also, there were Zoroastrians who are still the native religion of Iran before Islam had come in. There were still some Zoroastrians there, and there were many of those who became Baha'is as well, particularly young people. There were less Christians at this time in history. There were some, but less during Baha'u'llah's time. Most of the people in the lands in which his religion were spreading were not Christian. It hadn't yet reached a Christian lands. That would happen later. But I'm from a Christian background, and many of the Baha'is in the world are from a Christian background, so it certainly has spread there. But, you know, I wanted to share with you one tablet that Baha'u'llah revealed. He had a dialogue with an Orthodox priest when he was in Akka. And the Christians in those areas were starting to get very interested in Baha'u'llah's claims. And so Baha'u'llah revealed a tablet back to this Christian that deals with a lot of Christian themes. And I was always struck by it, and I've always been struck by this passage. This is a tribute that Baha'u'llah wrote for Christ, and it's remarkable. He says, know thou that when the Son of Man is a title that Christ himself used in the Gospels for himself. Know thou that when the Son of Man yielded up his breath to God, the whole creation wept with a great weeping. By sacrificing himself, however, a fresh capacity was infused into all created things. The deepest wisdom which the sages have uttered, the profoundest learning which any mind has unfolded, the arts which the ablest hands have produced, the influence exerted by the most potent of rulers, are but manifestations of the quickening power released by his transcendent, his all-pervasive and resplendent spirit. Blessed is he who with a face beaming with light hath turned towards him. I think of this passage a lot because I have a lot of Christian friends, I have Christian family members, and I think about their relations with Christ, and oftentimes this line comes into my head, blessed is he who with a face beaming with light hath turned towards him. And it allows me to feel like we're really practicing the same religion, which of course we are. But you know, it's interesting because Baha'u'llah outlines a role for Christ's sacrifice that is even greater and more impactful than I think what even Christians recognize. That the deepest wisdom, you know, sort of the energy behind all of that, the profoundest learning, the arts, the impact of the rulers, that the energy behind that was due to the quickening power released by Christ's martyrdom. So very striking passage, very beautiful. You know, when you come to read the writings of Baha'u'llah over time, they become your companion, and they are so beautiful. In his Kitabi Akdas, which is the most holy book, Baha'u'llah describes his own words. He said, they who recite the verses of the All-Merciful in the most melodious of tones will perceive in them that which the sovereignty of earth and heaven can never be compared. These verses draw hearts that are pure unto those spiritual worlds that can neither be expressed in words nor intimated by illusion. Blessed be those who hearken. There is this sense that Baha'u'llah's revelation, his words, the word of God, pulls us up. It pulls us up to worlds, levels of consciousness, if you will, that we can't get to otherwise. And there's a magic in these words. I can't describe it to you any differently than that. And you'll feel it when you begin to read them. So Baha'u'llah was, eventually the imprisonment in Akka was relieved. The Ottoman Empire itself was falling into decay and was falling apart and really did not survive the 19th century. And so they began to less and less to be concerned with Baha'u'llah's imprisonment. And the people around Akka had come to love him so much. The mayor of Akka came to him and said, what can I do for you? I want to do something that is of service to you. And Baha'u'llah said, the water aqueduct that runs into the city has fallen into disrepair and should be repaired. As a gift to me, can you repair that? Because that way the people of the city will have fresh water. So this gives you a sense of Baha'u'llah and what he was about. But he eventually, Abdu'l-Baha, Baha'u'llah's son, who was really on the forefront of dealing with the community around Baha'u'llah, was able to secure a dilapidated mansion that had fallen itself into disrepair and that had been abandoned in a cholera epidemic. He was able to rent it. And Baha'u'llah's imprisonment was relaxed, and they were able to come and stay in this mansion. And this is the place that Baha'u'llah's life, where he spent the remaining years of his life. It's been renovated now. It didn't look like this at the time, but it was renovated, and it was beautiful, and it had gardens around it and so forth. And Baha'u'llah would receive pilgrims there until 1892 when he passed away at the mansion of Bachi, it's called. So this is the shrine of Baha'u'llah at the mansion of Bachi in Israel, now where the Baha'i World Center is. It is only in Israel because that's where Baha'u'llah ended his exile and his life ended there. And there are, the administrative center is there. There are almost 1,000 people who serve at the Baha'i World Center in a variety of activities. And it's the place of pilgrimage for all Baha'is, particularly to go to the shrine of Baha'u'llah. A year before his passing, Baha'u'llah revealed a short tablet called the Book of My Covenant. And in that he addresses the people of the world, his own followers, his children. He makes it clear that they should turn to his son Abdu'l-Baha for guidance moving forward. But I captioned a couple of passages out of that so that you could see what he said. He said, "O ye that dwell on earth, the religion of God is for love and unity. Make it not the cause of enmity or dissension." And then he says something very clear. He says, conflict and contention are categorically forbidden in his book. And then he says, to drive home that point, he says, this is a decree of God. It is divinely preserved from annulment and is invested by him with the splendor of his confirmation. Verily, he is the all-knowing, the all-wise. Baha'u'llah's religion is a religion of peace. Conflict and contention are categorically forbidden, even verbal contention. That which is conducive to the regeneration of the world and the salvation of the peoples and kindreds of the earth has been sent down from the heaven of the utterance of him who is the desire of the world. That's a reference to himself. His scriptures, his writings, the word of God for today is that which is conducive to the regeneration of the world. Better is this for you than all that is on earth. When a revelation of God comes into the world, it is our vehicle of salvation as a world and as individuals. And better is it for us to turn unto it than anything else on earth. So with that, I'll conclude my comments on Baha'u'llah. There's so much more to talk about. I wanted to do this talk, and I heavily put the writings of Baha'u'llah in it because I wanted you to get a feel for the beauty and majesty of his words. We're going to be doing in our podcast, we're going to focus a lot on reading the writings, and we'll just simply take one passage at a time and talk them through with several guests and people joining, and it'll be a lot of fun. I hope you join us for that podcast. I don't know if we have time for questions or at least comments and thoughts. It would be wonderful to hear from others.
Yeah, thank you so much. That was a really great talk. It was just so comprehensive, thorough overview of his life and his mission. Well, we do have time for questions. We can have a few questions. So if you have a question, you can either write it in the chat and I'll read it out loud, or you can use the Zoom raise hand function, which you can find by clicking participants at the bottom of your screen and then clicking the blue button, which is raise hand. So it looks like we have a question from Matab, so I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you so much, Dr. Williams. It was a great, great talk. Like, even I'm born in a Baha'i family, and I'm amazed like how you converted and you have this deep understanding of the faith. Like that was like really amazing.
Oh, thank you.
No, I never had like a conversation with like a person who has converted and has deep understanding of the faith, you know?
Yeah.
And the talk was really amazing that you talked about a lot of things that I never heard before. So it was really amazing.
Thank you, Mahtab. That's very kind. I worked hard to try and pull things together that everyone would enjoy.
But actually, the question was, how did you like have this like understanding of the faith? Is it just by readings or like, you know?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, it is by reading. I think that, you know, I was 16 years old and I fell in love with Baha'u'llah, and it's been, you know, I think for all Baha'is, when you see this presentation and the quotes, you have to ask yourself, what's this all about? I mean, they're so powerful, right? And so it sets you off on a journey to try and understand more deeply what Baha'u'llah is talking about. It's magnificent. There's no way we're ever going to understand it. I mean, I read passages.
Because, you know, it's kind of like learning a new language. Like,
yeah.
When you start to learn a new language, for example, for me, English is my second language. I would never be able to speak like an American person who born in America. So that's something I know. But I had a feeling that even though you were not born in a Baha'i family, your understanding was much better than like people who born in a Baha'i family. And that is like amazing. Like I was like thrilled and I was listening and I was just like, and your talk brought tears to my eyes several times during like the entire talk. So I was just like, is it just because, or probably you were very, very interested. That's also possibility.
I think so, but you know, it's not me. I mean, it's the majesty of Baha'u'llah's revelation. All I try to do is to tell you the stories and try to pull it together in a way that made sense to just tell the story. But I mean, and I used a lot of quotes. I hope it wasn't too much, but I really wanted to give people a feel. If you've never heard of the faith, you don't know anything about Baha'u'llah, to really get a sense of what we Baha'is know. I mean, this is really an amazing body of truth, and it's important that the world gets to know about it.
Because you brought up the aspects that I grew up in a Baha'i family, so you brought up the aspects that I never even think about them. So
that's wonderful.
That was really amazing. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Join our podcast when we start up.
Sure.
I don't know if it'll work with your time zone. I don't know where you're calling from, but
I'm in Philly now.
Oh, are you? Okay, great.
And actually, I moved here last month, so I've been only here for like a month.
That's great.
Yeah.
Barmac has a question.
Yes.
So, okay, you can go ahead. I'm going to unmute you now.
Thank you. Just a short question. Did you say you also have, you will be having a series of podcasts about Baha'u'llah and his teachings? And the second question is, do you have one about, into more detail about the Bab's writings and teachings?
Thank you, Barmac. Thank you so much. I have put together on the website Sifter of Dust at the time of the celebration of the bicentenary of the Bab's, the 200 years of his birth, which was in 2019, 200 years rather. I put together a series of talks on the Bab's writings that was based on a workshop I'd done at the Philadelphia Baha'i Center. And you're welcome to listen to that. It's part of a thing I put together called the Foundations of the Revelation series. A lot of what I've been doing and did in this talk is because I had to research so much to get that done. So those are there. They're part of a podcast that you can download. You can listen online, but I think it's on iTunes. So we're starting the podcast October 1st, and unfortunately, I feel that there's a need to still tell a little bit more Baha'i story for the public, because I would love the public to start joining the podcast. And it's really for the public, where we're actually going to take one or two quotes from the writings and talk about them. And I invite you all to join. And I really want to encourage, I'm trying to get the public to join, but if you want to have something for the public, lots of people don't know anything about the faith. So I wanted to front load it with a couple of these talks, this one on Baha'u'llah, and then I'll do one on Abdul Baha and Shoghi Effendi and the House of Justice as well. So.
Great. We also have a question from Josh, so I'm going to unmute him now.
All right. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for the talk today. If my question is too far removed from the topic or what you plan to speak about, just tell me and I'll move on.
Oh, there are no bad questions, Josh.
Great. So I've been someone who's been sort of, I guess, on the fringes of the Baha'i faith for a while now. Mm-hmm. And one of the things that I've encountered in the Baha'i writings and the writings of Baha'u'llah is this sense of historical inevitability, that it's inevitable that we're going to reach this place of peace. Yes. It's inevitable that history is moving in a particular direction. And as a historian, we put a lot of stake in human action and free will. And so I'm wondering if I guess how those two things, free will and inevitability, historical inevitability, how those can both be true. Where does free will fit in if we're inevitably moving towards world peace? And maybe if something about the station of Baha'u'llah or the writings of Baha'u'llah provide an answer to that question.
So That's a very good question, Josh, and it's not an easy question to answer. And I've certainly thought about it myself. Baha'u'llah frames things occasionally in that way. You know, we shall cause, I mean, that slide that I showed of the, we shall cause these sciences to develop, right? But Baha'u'llah is very clear that it's up to us, right? I mean, it's free will. I mean, it's the whole, that is very much the purpose. And so how do we think about these two things, right? And, you know, in one sense, I think there's an interesting tablet of Abdu'l-Baha in which he talks about the knowledge of a manifestation. And I find this interesting. And he said, it's like that they have a knowledge of the world and the spiritual state of things, if you will, in the same way that a doctor has a knowledge of human diseases and how they play themselves out. So I found that very interesting because, and that Baha'u'llah is telling us that, and even Baha'u'llah refers to himself as the divine physician, the divine doctor, right, who is prescribing a remedy, given the knowledge of the diseases that exist in human society, right? And, you know, for me, as a doctor, who I practice both in hospital environments and I practice as a generalist. I'm a generalist. I practiced along the entire spectrum. So I've seen people at death's door, but then I've also seen people come into me with just some high cholesterol when they first, you know, get recognized. One of the things you become as a doctor is you get very sophisticated about predicting things. And it arises out of knowledge. You know that if somebody has certain conditions, at a certain degree of severity, their risk of something happening that's bad is very high. It's baked into the nature of those diseases, right? It's baked into the nature of how the human body interacts when you have out of control diabetes and a cholesterol of 700. You know, you're walking, what my doctor says is a walking time bomb, right? And, but you get predictive ability. So I think that when I think about Baha'u'llah's statements in that regard, I think that's what he means. I think that he is telling us the natural history of the diseases that afflict the human race and where they will lead if we don't right them. But we have to do it ourselves, just like my patients have to do it themselves. There's nothing I can do. I can give them some medication. I can. So, but the language around we shall cause, I think also, you know, humanity probably needs a little bit of divine stimulus. I don't know. And that's maybe just it, you know, that there's a little bit of energy that's infused into the system to give us the power to do that. And I think that, you know, ultimately, this is one of the things I've learned from reading the Baha'i writings. You know, everything comes from God. So sometimes Baha'u'llah frames it that way, just to kind of communicate that. But that's the way I think about it. I think about it that he's like me diagnosing a disease, understands where it's headed predictably, and knows the path out of it. And that's how I balance those two things. But it's a very difficult question. And Baha'u'llah actually explicitly states in one of his statements that God does know the end of things, but that is not the cause of it. He says there's a difference between knowing the end of things and causing the end of things, or knowing something will happen and causing something to happen. He specifically and explicitly in many passages of his writings honors human free will. So, but that's a really good question and one that's worth a lot of discussion. The kind of thing we'll do on our podcast, by the way.
That was great. So any other questions? So now I'm just going to introduce our speaker for next week. Our speaker next week will be Masood Olufani, and his topic will be America's Racial Problem from a Baha'i Perspective. And again, these talks occur every Saturday at noon Eastern Daylight Time, so please invite your friends and family. If you'd like to be on the weekly mailing list for these events, please reach out to the email that we're going to put in the chat below. And now we're just going to close with a Baha'i song.
Will you give your life to Baha'u'llah? Will you give your life give my heart to Baha'u'llah. Yes, I'll be a flame of fire, a river of light, and give my heart to Baha'u'llah. Will you give your life to Baha'u'llah? Will you give your life to Baha'u'llah? Will you be a flame of fire, a river of light? Give your life to Baha'u'llah, to Baha'u'llah, to Baha'u'llah, to Baha'u'llah.
Have a good week, everyone. I hope we all see you next Saturday. Bye.
Bye.